I appreciate it. I would also like to say a few thanks before I start. I'd like to say thanks to my amazing agent, Samantha Haywood. And I mean, if I try to tell you how wonderful she is, she's so wonderful that she took me on even though I write essays. So that's how wonderful she is. Those of you who are writers will know what that means. I also want to thank Kelsey and Naomi and Deborah Willis at Freehand, as well as Natalie Olson at Kiss Cut Design for the amazing, vibrant cover that makes me happy every time I look at it. And Sarah Levitt, who was the accountability buddy par excellence. She pulled me through this book. Thank you, Sarah. Lorna Crozier, Helen Humphreys, Brenda Miller, Catherine Aschenberg, who shepherded me through the first long essay in the book at Banff, and my many writing friends, the Backroom Broads in Vancouver, the Villanelles in Kingston, who sent me a beautiful bouquet of flowers, which is behind me there, my essay writing group in cyberspace, and Fiona Lamb, and especially Mark and LJ. That's the family, and all of you for coming. So I'm just going to start off with the first few pages of the book to give you a little taste. Possibilities. Possible places to bring a book. Your bed under the blankets with a flashlight. The bath. The back seat of the car if you are brave or foolish or lucky enough never to get sick on the winding roads, or smart enough to open a window against the fumes of your parents' cigarettes. Smart enough to peel your eyes from the page every once in a while and watch the telephone poles flit past, flit past. Try the fork of an apple tree in May, where you can prop your feet against the facing branch and suck the scent of blossoms from your lungs to the soles of your shoes. Behind the neighbor's house, the sun will sink, staining the sky the shade of pink at blossom's core. Petals and page gleam white and whiter in the half-light. The doctor's office, the dentist, the lunch counter at the local delicatessen, the dock, the deck, the porch, the beach. The couch in the room where everybody else watches TV. Sink unseen into its green cushions, leaf through a dozen chapters to the ripples of canned laughter. The schoolroom, where you can slip your book inside the regulation reader, while your classmates sound out words like see, spot, run. Your tongue can try out catapult, and luminous, and ravishing, and riverine. Tap the syllables against your teeth, roll them like a chocolate egg along the roof of your mouth, savor your guilty, solitary joy. Rain splatters the windowsills, radiators hiss and hum. The air reeks of mucilage and damp mittens, while forgotten, at the back of the room, you lose yourself in story and sound, where, with your secret book within a book, you might be any she or he or they or we or I.
Thank you so much for that reading, Susan. I love how this book starts with this second person address. And you have these interludes throughout the book where you're speaking directly to the reader, and to the reader literally, because it's kind of from one reader to another, right? Talking about the life of the reader. And I guess I just want to let you talk about that, why you started the book and the reading with that particular passage. It seems to speak to so many of the themes throughout the book. And I just wanted to say, like, I relate so much to that passage, and I'm sure a lot of people here do that, like, kind of becoming a person and a reader at the same time, always having a book with you, kind of having the book with you in different places so that you're experiencing like that place and you're experiencing the book that you have with you at the same time. And also the hiding the book inside the work that you're actually supposed to be doing in school is a very strong memory of mine as well. So I'd love for you to just talk about that passage and those second person interludes throughout the book in general.
Yeah, I mean, I had, when I started writing the book, I I knew I was going to write about reading, and I had written some of the longer essays before I kind of knew it was a book. And initially I conceived of it, I think, as a book about the spaces and places where we read, because I had written about libraries, and I'd written a little bit. I knew I was going to write about bookstores because I spent a lot of time working in a bookstore. But what I really wanted to get at was the feeling of what it's like to read, you know, the emotional feeling of what it's like to read. And I think that's why I wanted to go for the second person in those interludes, because it's a much more intimate voice. And it's just like, you know, your own voice inside your head, your best friend's voice inside your head, something like that. And I thought that maybe I'd get closer to that feeling, the emotional experience of it. And the question sort of at the heart of it all was, why do some books stick with us and shape or shadow our lives? Not necessarily our favorite books either. Sometimes they're books that we don't particularly like. And so that was sort of something that was driving all of the essays as well.
Yeah, and I guess, like, to me, that's so much about also how someone who is a big reader, as you say in your title, that kind of is part of what forms your identity. And sometimes, like you were saying, a book that's really memorable or that sticks with you, it may be because of the content of the book, and it may be also because what was happening in your life when you read it, and how those things kind of seemed to be connected, at least, you know, because they happen at the same time, or even because what you're reading informs how you understand your life and the events of your life. And I actually wanted to ask you about the first essay in here, in Anna Karenina Furs, which I actually was teaching to my creative writing classes before I was assigned as an editor to this book. So I was very excited to get to be your editor after having been such a fan of the first essay in it already. And you do this amazing thing where you talk about, it's a memoiristic essay where you talk about a period in your own life that was difficult, and where the events of your life at the time, which were essentially your marriage breaking up and your next relationship beginning, are in a way something that's happened to many, many people. It's like always dramatic, and it's also kind of, if not universal, then very recognizable. The way that you understood it as universal and as meaning something was through literature, and then also through a book that you'd read in the past long ago, and then went back and read again and realized that you were reading it differently and reading yourself differently. So anyway, I've said a lot, so I'm just going to let you talk about that and how it works throughout this book.
Yeah, well, I think, I mean, one reason that I was understanding myself through literature was because I was terribly lonely. I was really stuck without friends and without work, and I, you know, what was I going to do? Of course I was going to read. I always read. But why that book, you know, it just pulled me back in a way that kind of surprised me. And I realized, well, these are the trope of the adulterous woman in our culture is one that is, you know, very strong, and the woman always has to suffer and be blamed for whatever she's done. And of course I was feeling a lot of guilt, and as well as a lot of confusion. And so I think, you know, I was puzzling it all through as I reread Anna Karenina, and got quite angry, of course, as I was initially. I was also angry the first time I read it, that why does the woman have to suffer? Why? And I got angry all over again reading it the second time. But I also saw, I think it was the third time that I read it, that I saw the whole situation quite differently and had a little more sympathy for some of the other characters. Yeah.
Right. Like poor Karenin.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I still don't love the man, but
wouldn't want to be married to him.
No, I wouldn't want to be married to him, and I'm glad she left him. But
yeah. Actually, and reading this essay actually made me want to read Anna Karenina, which I had never read. So Thanks to you, I read Anna Karenina. And that's one of the wonderful things about this book is that not only introduces you to, it introduces you to the books that Susan reads and then talks about in the book. And I don't know about other readers, but it certainly made me want to go and read all of them in light of what you had said about them. But then you don't have to have read the books as a reader to get everything out of the essay that's there, right? So it's really amazing how you do that. And another thing I wanted to ask you about is how you, I mean, of course, you're a writer as well as a reader, and being a reader and being a writer are very interwoven. Mm-hmm. And you almost kind of, it sounds like, became a writer in some way almost as soon as you became a reader, or that mm-hmm. kind of planted in your mind very early, mm-hmm. and that starts to evolve in a person. So I was wondering if you could talk about that a bit, what you were trying to do in this book, talking about the evolution of not just being a reader, but being a writer.
You know, I don't know that I was conscious of doing that. Probably that was just because that's the way it was for me. I think you're right that I pretty much, you know, decided that I wanted to write very shortly after I started reading. I mean, I do write a bit about becoming a writer in the book as well. Not too much, but there are a couple of essays that hit on that. Yeah. Where it's woven through. I'm not sure what I have to say about that exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
There's one essay, A Pilgrimage to Hamstead, or Household Pets of the Great and Lesser Poets, where you write about going to visit the houses of famous writers and trying to find this like essence of them, or of how they wrote, or of like their work in their house. And then you talk about how, like, you describe it as like this Zeno's paradox kind of situation where like you seem to get closer, but you never get there. I love that. I was wondering maybe if you could talk about that essay a little bit.
Yeah, well, I mean, like a lot of the essays in this book, actually, it grew out of a sorrow, actually a series of sorrows. And the one that starts the essay is my cat died, and my cat had been a 14-year companion. And so I was grieving for him, but I was also grieving because I couldn't have children. And so we traveled to London to see Keats' house. And of course, Keats, for those of you who know, led a very difficult, very short, but very difficult life, and had numerous losses throughout his life. So anyway, finding yourself in the house of this great poet was both hilarious and moving at the same time. But I guess I won't say what happens in the house.
Yeah.
Say that it's connected with cats. So.
Yeah. And I find it so interesting, that whole notion of going to a particular place where someone else has been and like trying to find something that is like elusive, some kind of essence of them or their writing or what happened in their life or something. And
it's an intangible feeling. And of course, I don't think you ever really find it, but you find something else if you're lucky, and make something of it. Yeah.
So you feel like it's a worthwhile thing to do?
Well, I mean, I can't speak for other people.
It was for you.
It was
you got this essay out of it.
It was for me in that case.
Yes, definitely. It definitely was, because we got this beautiful essay. Okay. Well, we're going to have another reading from Susan shortly. But before that, I just want to skip ahead a bit. And this is something we can come back to too, because it seems extremely relevant here. But in one of your essays, you write about essays and the essay form and how you came to learn about it, and like when you first started reading essays, you're like, what the heck is this? And then came to embrace it, and to certainly master the form of the essay, which is, I guess, becoming more popular now. But like, you don't write about how you'd never even really heard of this way of writing when you started reading them, and certainly hadn't thought about trying to do it, let alone, or read them even, let alone writing them. So why, can you talk to us a bit about the essay form and how you came to it and what it means to you? Why is this the way that you prefer to write, do you think?
Well, I mean, I came to it in my late teens, early 20s, when I was working in a bookstore, and I was reading whatever they had. And they did have a shelf of essays, although I don't even think that's what they called it. I don't actually even know what it was called. But I started reading these works, and I just fell in love with the form. I mean, I think part of it was that it feels so intimate and so exploratory at the same time. And also it's so wide ranging. I mean, the subject matter can be anything at all. And so if as a curious person, I thought I was learning all the time. Every time I'm reading a new essay, I'm learning something different. And also I think I mean, the essay is sort of known for its loose form, or its absence of form, or its seeming absence of form. But in fact, I found that isn't always the case. I mean, the more essays I read, the more I felt their kinship to poetry. And I mean, they really sort of, the finest essays really, I think, blend narrative with the strength of metaphor that you find in poetry, as well as with, you know, the kind of information that you get in you know, just straight nonfiction. So I find it a really rich and inviting form. And I think it's just, it's sort of home. I do write fiction and I write poetry too. So it's not that it's the only form that I write in at all. It's just that it's kind of home. It's kind of how I think, I guess.
And so when you start writing, do you know that you're writing an essay, or is it like, maybe this is a story, maybe this is something else? Or do you have a kind of structure in your mind of where it's going to go?
Yeah, you know, so I do know if it's an essay versus a story versus a poem, but I might call on the same material and write in different genres about the same thing. So it's just that, like, you're exploring different questions in a slightly different way, I think. And so, yeah, it's kind of hard to express what it is, but you know, I mean, with a poem, you're really, you know, really leaning very, very heavily on the language, and it's on the word level, and image and metaphor, and you're doing those things with an essay as well, but you're also kind of expanding outward into narrative and into a sort of slightly more expansive structure, and drawing in different threads of information. I think what I love about the essay is it's all about making connections. And that's what I'm always, you know, seeing the connections everywhere and trying to draw them together somehow.
Yeah, and it looks like in the chat, a lot of people, the connection between essays and poetry are really resonating. It's really resonating for people, that there's something similar about those forms, or that even an essay is kind of like a long poem in a way. And I guess it depends on the essay, but the one that you're going to read from next, I think, is very much like that, I think, because of the way that you weave together three different stories in a way, and three different themes, three different subjects. And so maybe, do you want to tell us a little bit about it? And then there's also going to be a slideshow to accompany it. So maybe introduce it and explain what we're going to see.
Yeah, sure. So this essay is called Light Reading, and it's actually, in the essay, I tell the story that is the sort of the source of the title of the book, Big Reader. Part of the essay, 1/3 of the essay, is about my mother's history with low vision, and she was losing her vision, and and she loved to read and wasn't able to read. And so my brother and I had it in our heads that we would get her one of these machines that would help her. And it was kind of like, at the time, this was a number of years ago, it was like a big, heavy microfiche thing that would allow people with very low vision to see better than they could otherwise see. And we we got it for her, but it was a bit of a failure for a number of reasons that I outline in the essay. But her story actually, I think I was thinking about her, but I was also thinking about myself when I wrote this essay, because I felt that I was losing reading too. And in fact, that's one of the motivations, I think, for the whole book. I wrote the essays in this book over a period of about a decade, and the decade was a difficult one when I lost both parents. There were another number of other family things going on that made life stressful and difficult at times. And writing was difficult. It was very difficult to find and make time for writing, and reading was difficult too, at least reading that wasn't obligatory. I was reading all the time, but I wasn't necessarily finding joy in reading and wasn't able to read for joy. And so I think that sort of heartache is really at the core of the book. I was almost on a quest to try to find my way back to that joy. So, so another strand of the essay sort of talks about that. And then the final strand of the essay is about the photographer, Andre Kertész, who, well, I'll tell you in a moment a bit more about him, but he photographed readers throughout his life. And he even has a little book about, you can maybe see it in the background on the shelf there. He has a book of photographs about reading and readers. And so, yeah, I'll just leave it there. I think that introduces it. And it's just a very short passage from that section about him. Books draw us inward, even when we're most in public. The great photographer Andre Kertész made a lifelong project of exploring that paradox. Between 1950 and the 1970s, he traveled the world, snapping candid photos of people with their books, their magazines, and the occasional newspaper. On rooftops, behind stage doors, on trains, in parks, in bars and shops, bent over trash bins, tucked into alcoves. Wherever he found readers, he recorded them in the act. Reading is the great leveler, the great lifter, his images seem to suggest. In the republic of books, we are all equal. There is something almost unbearably poignant about these photographs today. Yet what we sense when we look at them is more than wistfulness for an imagined past, more than mere nostalgia. Shot from unexpected angles, they conceal complexities. Often we have to work to discern the subject within the frame. The experience mimics the act portrayed. In these images, we don't simply witness someone reading. Instead, we read someone reading. So what we feel when we look at them is something akin to deep reading's deep engagement.
Thank you so much, Susan. Those are such beautiful photographs, and you write about them so beautifully.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, it's a really incredible essay, and the photographs are really incredible too. And one thing that you write about in that essay is you kind of muse about, in several different ways and contexts, what counts as reading, right? And I mean, you kind of ponder the question of, what would a photograph look like now of a bunch of people scrolling on their phones? It's not quite the same thing, right? Or is it? And is it different? Why is it different? We have that intuition that it is different and somehow lesser, but then maybe you seem to imply in your essay, that feeling that it's not as good reading on a screen or listening to an audiobook, or in your mother's case, reading on the big reader, as it's called. we have that sense that it's not really reading, but maybe after a while we get used to it and maybe it really is reading after all. And I know that you have become a fan of audiobooks yourself after
Huge.
not being so sure.
Yeah.
So I'd love to hear about that. I mean, what counts as reading and what doesn't, and why? And I know you don't have the definitive answer to that question, but
well, no, but I mean, I did a lot of reading on this, on the science of reading, right? And so, I mean, I learned that really they do say that it's different. Reading on the page does have, the neurobiology of it is different and the effects are different, and screen reading does not, it doesn't sort of have the sort of meditative powers for us. But I think that, I mean, some of that can be mitigated, I think, to some degree, depending on how we approach it. And I mean, as we've learned this year, technology can be troublesome, but it also can be life-saving at times. So I think, you know, to completely write it off and say, oh no, this is this is not real reading is really probably foolish and short-sighted of us. So and for me personally, audiobooks have truly been amazing. I mean, I'm just so grateful for them because I can listen, and it's that intimate voice, right? Once again, and I take in and remember a lot more than I anticipated I would. I had thought that it would be, oh, it won't stick, but typically it does. You know, maybe in a slightly different way. That I don't know. Yeah.
I love audiobooks too. And at first I was probably in the camp that it wasn't really reading, but it is, maybe it's something a bit different, but it certainly isn't worthless. And it actually makes you slow down, right? Because you can't skim when you're listening to an audiobook. You can't skip anything.
Right.
Yeah, which and it takes a lot longer to listen to a book than to read it.
And what I find too is that it often makes me do both. So if I listen and I find the book structurally really interesting, I'll then go out and buy the hard copy of the book so that I can look at how the author has managed that as well. So yeah, it's great.
And like you said, you did quite a bit of research on the neurology of reading and the actual effects on the brain. So I'm sure other people would love to hear about that too, kind of a bit about what you discovered there and maybe some of the
oh my God,
surprising things. I know
that was ages ago.
Oh, sorry. Never mind.
No, I don't. Yeah, I don't really remember a huge amount of what I learned, but you can find out by reading the book.
You certainly can, and I very much recommend that you do because it's fascinating stuff. And it really, really is the actual effects on your brain from reading, and the differences between reading on a screen and reading in a book. Like the quantifiable studied differences about what happens to us neurologically when that's happening are like surprising and fascinating.
Well, and just actually one of the things that I found most interesting, like on the sciencey end of it all, was that our brains really were never designed to read. And so basically our brains have to, it's been likened to a 3-ring circus, the contortions they have to go through. So they have to sort of, there's a section of the brain that has to do with image recognition, and another section of the brain that has to do with, you know, putting patterns together and stuff like that. And our brains have to put all of these things together in a way that it is, I guess, unnatural in a sense, and yet we do it, and we do it. So most of us do it quite easily, in fact. So it's kind of an interesting bit of information.
Yeah, and like we tend to assume, or I mean, and probably rightly so, that reading is good for us. You know, no matter what. Do you think that's do you think that's true?
Well. But of course.
I mean, certainly reading your book is good for us, and everybody should definitely buy it. It's such a pleasure and such a gift to all of us who are readers, big readers like yourself.
But I also don't think that reading should have to fulfill that function of being good for us or making us morally better or anything like that. I mean, it's
or
also
smarter,
plain, or smarter or anything. Like it should be, we should be able to read and just for pleasure and
for entertainment.
And to enjoy it. Yeah. No.
And I mean, I think that probably really anyone who does read a lot, that's why we do it, right? Because we find it pleasurable. It's not really because, you know, we think it's like bitter medicine that we're forcing down that's going to improve our brains.
Or
just
improve
like
our lives.
Yeah. And yeah, exactly. Or, you know, make us more empathetic or whatever it is. And like that first little section you read about reading in school when you were supposed to be doing something else, that really made me think about, I mean, I used to do that all the time when I was a kid, and I always felt so guilty. There was always this kind of feeling that like I was reading when I was supposed to be doing something else, like reading when I was supposed to be doing math, or reading when I was supposed to be asleep, or whatever, reading when I was supposed to be like at the dinner table having a conversation or whatever. And so it gives reading this kind of feeling of like what's the word, that it's a little bit transgressive or rude, at least.
Yeah.
You know? And like a bit of a guilty pleasure. And so the fact that, you know, it's often framed in our culture as something that you should force yourself to do because it's good for you, it's just so it's sad. It's really sad, because reading is such a amazing pleasure that it feels like it must not be good for you sometimes. It's like eating like a big pile of candy. Is there anything that I haven't asked you about that you were hoping to talk about?
Well, why don't we see if there are questions from people in the group?
Yes, there certainly are lots and lots of comments and questions. About audiobooks, about subversive reading is the best reading, says Elizabeth Green, but it's not good for housework, says Elaine Harvey. But
right.
Yeah, I'll start asking you some of the questions here, and anyone else who has questions, please just drop them into the chat. So we have a question from Marianne Moore. First of all, Susan, what began the Hamstead essay, the sorrow or the pilgrimage? She says, I'm wondering if the various parts come as you go along, or are they all in mind as you begin?
Okay. So it's a while since I wrote that one. I think I started just by writing about my cat, and I didn't know I was going to write about Keats at all. I think that's how it began. And then, and no, I don't always know all the parts that are going to go into it. They just sort of, they accumulate, you know, bit by bit as I write. Usually I'll write some scenes. I'll start out by hand writing bits of things, and then I start sort of, you know, if sometimes something will sort of, it begins to feel like something's taking hold, or something's, you know, getting roots maybe. and then it kind of grows, and there's more to it, and I realize, oh, I really want to connect this with that, or somehow I feel a kind of inchoate sense that they are connected, and I just need to figure out how. So yeah,
when we were talking about poetry and essays, someone, I think it was Katerina Edwards, posted in the chat that it's all like essays are all about connections, those connections between things, and in the same way as poetry is, like it's an intuitive kind of connection. You wouldn't necessarily have thought of those things as being related in any kind of obvious or rational way, but then they become connected, and they become connected like poetically and intuitively. Katerina didn't say all of that, but she said part of it. Oh, good. There's lots of questions coming. Okay, so I will stop talking and ask you the questions. So Marian Agnew says, have you ever started a poem and discovered you were writing an essay, or vice versa?
Yes. Yes to both, I guess. Yes, both ways. Yeah. But again, sometimes the same material will work for both, you know, so maybe it's not an either or, but more like a both and. So I've started a poem and realized, okay, this needs to stretch out, but it might also still want to pare back in some sense. So yeah.
Donna Bethel, if I'm saying that right, asks, I noticed women make up a large part of the audience here. What do you think that says about essays? Or is it just about you?
I think it's just about me. It's not about essays. There are a lot of male essayists and really fantastic ones as well. And I think it's partly because a lot of my friends are women, and also because, and in this book in particular, maybe I write a lot about women's lives, and I write a lot about issues facing women, and a lot about misogyny, and a lot about just it's kind of a woman focused book, but I hope men will also enjoy it.
So do I. I think they will as soon as they pick it up and start reading it. I do notice that in a lot of these events, book launches, especially on Zoom, there's a lot of women. So yeah. I think a lot of readers are women.
Yeah, exactly.
For better or for worse. Yeah.
The vast majority of readers are women. Yeah. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Let's see here. Lots of questions now. This is Nancy O'Rourke, were you influenced by other essayists? If so, could you tell us who and why?
Yeah, well, I think I'm influenced by a lot of different essayists, but I'll just talk about one essay in particular, because the influences were really clear to me. I think a lot of times our influences as writers, we can't, like, you admire a lot of writers and you read them and you soak them up and you're getting them by osmosis, but do they influence you? It's hard to say. It's hard for us, to say about ourselves. Anyway, let the critics do that. But there was one essay where I was very consciously working with influences, and that was the essay called A Different River. And Frances Backhouse, who's a writer here in Victoria, wrote, I think in the Creative Nonfiction Collective Facebook group, where are the Canadian essays about cities along the lines of Joan Didion's Goodbye to All That? And, there was a conversation that happened in that group, and I thought about it and I thought about it, and where are those essays? Where are they? And okay, I guess I'm gonna have to write one. And like many people, Joan Didion's essay had meant a huge amount to me. It was one of the very first essays I mean, apart from Orwell, that was probably one of the earliest essays I ever read when I was, in my late teens. And I thought it was just amazing. And, I think it's so, that powerful nostalgia that moves it is one that speaks even to very young people. So yeah. I had remembered it and thought about it a lot and reread it a number of times over the years. But the other essay that had moved me tremendously, like just so more than I could say, was Richard Rodriguez's Late Victorians. And so that was another sort of pole star essay for me for my entire life. And putting those two essays together and thinking about the city where I had sort of come of age, Toronto, during the AIDS crisis, I had to write it. So that's a place where the influences were really, really clear. And, I don't think that I, can compare myself to those two essayists, but their voices were in my head very much when I was writing this. Yeah.
Thank you for that. We had a question from Madeline Sonic. Do your dreams ever influence your essays?
Yeah, well, sometimes in a couple of them, I actually write about my dreams. So I guess the answer to that would be yes. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a, dream almost our dreams are necessary for that making of intuitive connections, right?
Yeah.
There's a dream-like quality to that. Allison Lee says she's been devouring Big Reader and loves the way you talk about science and medicine with such clarity. What advice do you have about wearing your research lightly?
Oh my gosh, Allison, thank you so much. That's a real compliment because Allison is an amazing science and medical writer. So anyway, thank you. That's a real honor. I think I really don't know the answer to that. I mean, I think part of it is voice, right? A conversational tone. So you know, if you write with a sort of academic voice, it's going to come across that way. But if you can write in as close to a personal voice as, I mean, that's sort of that's the hallmark of the essay, right? Is that intimate personal voice. And so I think you're always sort of listening and maybe reading it aloud to practice it, hear how it sounds when you talk it. How does it, is it something that you would say, I mean, probably not in ordinary conversation, because I'm never that articulate in ordinary conversation, but in maybe ideal ordinary conversation, if that makes sense.
Yeah, like explaining things in a way that is both, I mean, I think what you do so well is that you explain things in a way that's so clear, and you resist the urge to include everything you know, which can sometimes be a little bit overwhelming at first when you've learned so much and you don't want to waste it, so you want to put it all in there, right?
Yeah, that's what the notes section is for. Right. There's a long section of notes at the end. Yeah.
And you have to kind of translate the language that you probably read that information into language that is very accessible and that's still your voice, right? And that seamlessly moves between your memoiristic storytelling and the information that you're conveying.
Yeah, maybe it helps to be kind of ignorant to start, right? Because I have to make it clear to myself. I have to figure it out. I have to try and understand it. And if I can understand it, presumably somebody else can.
Right.
Because I start out not knowing it. I don't know.
Right.
I dive in. I don't know any of this stuff. I'm not an expert on any of it at all.
Mm-hmm. So, yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. I mean, I don't think that automatically makes it easy to explain something, but like if you can explain it to yourself, you can explain it to someone else.
Yeah.
And it's also like what works so well, I think, in your book with the research is that it's not just plunked in there. It's like, oh, this is interesting. It's there for a reason. It's like, this is why this is relevant to this story that I'm telling. And so it's not just there for its own sake, which is fine because it's always interesting for its own sake, but it's also sheds light on something more personal, I suppose, or almost always. So that I think that makes it more accessible by kind of by definition.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Elaine Hayes says you reveal such intimate struggles in your essays. How do you override the urge to reduce this vulnerability and exposure? And then a whole bunch of people said, yeah, answer that.
Well, I guess maybe it's just I'm a fairly open person, I think. So maybe I don't feel as vulnerable on the, as it might feel to someone else. I think that's part of it. But also, I am making choices. I'm not revealing everything about myself. I'm revealing those things about myself that I've worked through sufficiently that I think that if somebody wants to challenge me on them or talk to me about them, I can feel okay about that. Not everyone will agree with my choices or my opinions or my feelings even. And that's okay. But I think if I really were feeling, I typically write about most of these things after the fact. Not always. There are essays that I've kind of written in the heat of the moment, but most often it's, after long reflection and time to come to terms with whatever period in my life I'm writing about. So that makes it, a lot different than if I were just writing off, like right in the moment, I think.
Mm-hmm. You have a bit of emotional distance.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, I've written about some personal stuff too, and I find that what happens too is like the more you work on the essay or the book or whatever it is, the more it just feels like a piece of writing that you're working on, and it starts to feel you just feel like almost forget it's personal.
Yes, you do. You really do. That's very accurate. It becomes separate. It's a separate thing from you, which is its own danger, right? I mean, I think there's research about memory and how it works, and how every time we rewrite a memory, in the case of writers, I mean, all of us do this, whether we're writers or not, right? We rewrite our memories, we have these narratives going in our heads. And every time we do that, we change it a little bit and remove it a bit from ourselves. And as writers, when we do that, it's possibly exacerbated, that whole thing. So yeah.
Yes. Yeah. I actually even had like really weird experiences of having written fiction that were kind of close to things that had happened to me, and then gone back to the place where it happened and been like, did that happen to me or to the character in my novel? I'm not sure. We do weird things to our own brains when we write about our experiences, for sure. So like coming back to the whole thing about sharing intimate details and feelings and stuff and events, I don't, like, in my experience, there's some people in my life who are somewhat horrified when I do that. I'm just wondering if you have that experience at all, or having confronted people that are shocked.
Yes. Yes, I have had that experience. Yeah. And I think that's part, it goes with the territory, and you kind of have to accept that that's how it's going to be. But I'm not sure that any writer is, safe from that, if you want to put it that way. I mean, I think there are things that you can do as an essayist or memoirist. You don't always want to do them, and you don't necessarily have to do them. I think these are personal decisions and depend on the situation. But you can talk with the people you're writing about if they're alive, and ask them if they're okay with how they're being portrayed. You can do your own research to make sure that your memories aren't completely off the wall. There are a whole bunch of things you can do to sort of ensure that you're not harming others, that you're not harming yourself, that you're but at the same time, even if you're writing fiction, somebody's going to object to what you said. So you just have to, you can't please everybody all the time. That's how it is.
I mean, I have this one friend that I have this conversation with all the time, because I think she feels that there's something kind of grotesque or even unethical about like having no decorum, like not just writing about other people, but writing about oneself in a way that's like too much or something. Like you should have this kind of veneer of respectability, and like once you told people about your worst moments and like your most humiliating moments, like there's no way you can ever get your respectability back. I mean, I guess obviously I disagree with that. It seems like obviously you must not care.
That's his problem, not my problem.
yeah, fair, agreed. So anything else, anybody? We're getting close to the end here, but maybe there's time for one more question. Laura Warshler says, when she reads other people's intimate stories, I receive these stories as gracious acts of sharing their humanity, and it makes it easier to try to do it in my own writing. So thanks to, she says, both of us for sharing.
Thank you.
Yeah. Oh, and people want another reading from you. Is that allowed, Kelsey?
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
All right, let's do it. That sounds like a beautiful way to wrap things up.
Okay, so this one is from an essay sort of closer to the end called Unruly People. In my second year of university, I took a job at an independently owned bookstore. The place was called Reader's Den, but there was nothing den-like about it. No mahogany, no oak, no crimson curtains, no whisper of sweet tobacco, no leather club chairs, no chairs of any description. Instead, it boasted bright track lights, row upon row of cheap white melamine shelves, a long newsstand continually in need of restocking, and an enormous floor-to-ceiling plate glass window that jutted on an angle to the southwest. The window overlooked busy Bloor Street, Across the road loomed the Royal Conservatory of Music, and beside it, Philosopher's Walk, a curving pathway to the campus shaded by horse chestnuts and maples. From the raised dais behind the cache, I could see the walk's wrought iron gates and the leaves on the old trees, lime green in spring, darker in the summer rains. I could see people come and go from the nearby shops and pubs and doctors' offices, mothers tugging their children's hands, lovers licking each other's ice cream cones, tourists consulting their maps. I liked this vantage point, high enough to offer prospect, yet close enough to yield details. It gave me license to stare. Once in early June, I was standing at the cache, gazing out that window, watching the white candles of the chestnuts blow themselves out on the ground, when I heard a familiar voice. "You brat." It was my 11th grade English teacher, Miss Abels. She lived nearby, I knew, because once she had taken my entire class to a performance of Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead. Afterwards, we'd gone back to her ground floor flat for coffee. Perched on her low couches and crowded cross-legged on her Killeen carpet, we'd analyzed the play while gawking at her high Victorian ceiling, her framed theatrical posters, her plants, her bentwood rocker, the objects on her fireplace mantle, the fireplace mantle itself, everything carefully chosen, everything deliberately arranged, everything advertising a woman of independence, and all of it evidence of an urban sophistication that none of us possessed and most of us envied. Finally, she led us all to the subway, and from there to the commuter train that would take us home to the suburbs, the slumbering, insipid suburbs. Now she looked me up and down. "What are you doing here?" she said. We talked. I told her what I was studying and when I expected to graduate. She raised an eyebrow as if to say that prognostications were all very well, but she'd save her praise for when she saw the proof. Then she paid for her magazine and walked out into the late spring afternoon, her long dark hair rippling in the breeze as she disappeared into the crowd. The brat remark stung. I thought I'd been a good student in that English class, good in comparison to how I'd been in most of my other classes, that is. At least I'd done the reading. At least I'd participated in discussions. But it seemed Miss Abel saw things differently. Or else my actual performance had left a less lasting impression than my general reputation. I'd been wayward, willful, irresponsible, and often truant as a teen. I was still most of those things. Thank you.
Sorry, I just couldn't find my unmute there, but thank you so much, Susan. That was a beautiful reading and a beautiful launch. Everyone is chiming in here with, you know, how can anyone here not want to read this book? I agree. I hope that everyone is able to pick up a copy and dive into these beautiful words and feel the kindred spiritness of readers. So I think that takes us to the end of our event. Anything that you wanted to wrap up with, Susan?
Just to say thank you to everyone for coming. Thank you so much. I could see a few of your faces, and I'll know later on who was here, and I really appreciate your being here. It's really, during this time, it means a lot. Yeah, thank you. And thank you, Kelsey and Naomi, for taking the time on a Sunday to do this.
Well, it was a real pleasure. It's a launch of ideas and a lot of love coming through here in the chat. So thanks everyone so much for coming. I'm going to turn off the recording here, and then, you know, feel free to chime in the chat or to, you know, turn on your mic and say hi after I've turned off the recording here. So thanks again. This wraps up the formal portion of this afternoon, whatever time it is. I don't know. Thank you, everyone.
Okay.